In the twilight years of the 13th century, when the world seemed both vast beyond imagination and intimate in its connections, Europe stirred with the restless energy of merchants and dreamers. Venice, that jewel of the Adriatic, rose from her lagoons like a vision of marble and gold, her countless ships threading through waters that carried whispers from distant lands. The year was 1254, and across the known world, threads of silk and silver were weaving patterns that would bind east to west in ways no man could yet foresee. Far beyond the Mediterranean's blue embrace, across deserts that burned like furnaces and mountains that scraped the very heavens, lay the greatest empire the world had ever known. The Mongol domains stretched from the Pacific shores to the gates of Europe itself, ruled by Khans whose word was law across 100 nations. In the heart of this vast realm, in palaces that gleamed with jade and gold, Kublai Khan held court over lands that seemed born from legend itself. The Silk Road, that ancient highway of dreams, pulsed with life as caravans wound their patient way through kingdoms and wastelands. Merchants from every corner of creation met at its crossroads, their voices a babel of tongues, their goods a treasury beyond any king's imagining. Spices that could cure the sick or drive men mad, silks softer than a lover's touch, gems that held captured starlight in their depths, all flowed westward, while European silver and wool made the return journey into the mystic East. Venice knew these treasures well, for her sons were the masters of this trade, their ships the bridges between worlds. In counting houses along the Grand Canal, men calculated profits from goods they had never seen, from lands they knew only through the tales of travelers. Yet among these merchants, some possessed a hunger that mere profit could not satisfy, a yearning to see with their own eyes the marvels that filled the warehouses, to walk the streets of cities whose names were whispered like incantations. The stage was set for a journey that would surpass all others, though none yet knew it. In the narrow streets of Venice, where the scent of salt air mingled with exotic spices, destiny was preparing to tap upon the shoulder of a family whose name would echo through the centuries, carrying with it tales of wonders that would reshape how men viewed their world. Niccolo and Marco Polo were merchants in the finest Venetian tradition, men whose eyes held the gleam of distant horizons and whose hearts beat with the rhythm of profitable enterprise. In the year 1260, when most men would have been content to trade within the familiar circuits of the Mediterranean, these brothers cast their gaze toward the legendary East and set forth on a journey that would change their lives forever. Their initial destination was Constantinople, that ancient bridge between Europe and Asia, where they intended to invest in precious stones and return with handsome profits to their Venetian counting houses. But fate, that most capricious of merchants, had different goods to offer. Political upheavals closed the familiar routes home, and the brothers found themselves drawn ever eastward, following trade routes that few Europeans had travelled. Through the lands of the Golden Horde they journeyed, across steppes where the wind sang ancient songs, and cities rose like mirages from the endless grass. They traded their goods for others, always moving toward the rising sun, until at last they reached Bukhara, that pearl of Central Asia, where they dwelt for 3 years as fortune's prisoners, unable to continue forward or return. It was there that destiny revealed her hand, in the form of an envoy bound for the court of the great Khan himself. This nobleman, struck by the brothers' knowledge and bearing, extended an invitation that would echo through history. Come with me to the presence of Kublai Khan, who has never beheld men of your land, and will receive you with honor beyond imagining. The palace of Kublai Khan, when they finally reached it, after a year's further travel, exceeded every dream of Eastern splendor. The great Khan, lord of more subjects than there were grains of sand upon a beach, received the two Venetians with a curiosity that bordered on wonder. Here were men from that distant realm called Europe, bearers of wisdom and customs unknown in his vast dominions. So fascinated was the Khan by his guests that when they finally begged leave to return to their homeland, he entrusted them with a mission of the highest importance. They were to bear his greetings to the Pope of Rome and request that 100 learned men be sent to teach his people the Christian faith. As a token of his favor and protection, he gave them a golden tablet inscribed with his seal, a passport that would ensure their safety throughout his domains. 9 years after their departure, the brothers returned to Venice, their purses heavy with jewels, but their hearts even heavier with memories of wonders seen and marvels witnessed. The Venice they found had changed in their absence, and among the changes was a new member of their family, Niccolo's son Marco, born during his father's absence, and now a youth of 15, bright-eyed and eager, who listened with growing amazement to tales of the Khan's great realm. Young Marco Polo possessed that rarest of gifts, eyes that could see wonder in the commonplace, and imagination vast enough to embrace the impossible. As he listened to his father and uncle recount their adventures in the court of Kublai Khan, something stirred within his spirit, a hunger that near Venetian prosperity could never satisfy. The narrow canals of his birth city, however beautiful, seemed suddenly confined when compared to the boundless horizons that beckoned from beyond the sunrise. In 1271, when the spring winds were stirring the waters of the lagoon toward restlessness, the Polo family began preparations for their second journey to the east. This time, they traveled not merely as merchants seeking profit, but as ambassadors bearing the blessing of the Holy Church and the hopes of the great Khan. Niccolo gathered his son Marco close as they made ready, seeing in the youth's eager eyes a reflection of his own younger self, yet sensing too that this journey would transform the boy in ways no father could foresee. Their first destination was Acre, that ancient port where the Crusader kingdoms clung to their precarious hold upon the Holy Land. Here they sought audience with Tedaldo of Piacenza, the papal legate, for Pope Clement IV had died during the brothers' long absence, and the church remained without a shepherd. Tedaldo listened with growing wonder to their account of Kublai Khan's request, recognizing in it an opportunity beyond price, the possible conversion of a world's mightiest empire to the Christian faith. Though they could not obtain the 100 learned men that Kublai Khan had requested, they were granted something precious beyond measure: oil from the lamp that burned eternally above Christ's sepulchre in Jerusalem. This holy substance, blessed by centuries of prayer and pilgrimage, would serve as their gift to the Khan, a token of the faith they carried with them into the unknown East. When Tedaldo himself was elected Pope Gregory X, he summoned the Polos to his presence and bestowed upon them letters of greeting for the great Khan, proclaiming them his official envoys. 2 Dominican friars were assigned to accompany them, learned men who would represent the church in that distant court. Yet as they journeyed through Armenia, where the very stones seemed to whisper of ancient sorrows, the friars' courage failed them. Overwhelmed by tales of the dangers ahead, they turned back, leaving the Polos to continue alone with their precious burden of holy oil and papal letters. And so it was that on a morning when the sun rose like a golden coin from the eastern mountains, Marco Polo, barely 17 years old, set forth from the last outposts of Christendom into a world of mystery and marvel that would test every fibre of his being and reward his courage with sights that no European eyes had ever beheld. The road to Cathay stretched before the polos like a ribbon of dreams and nightmares, woven together by the hands of gods and demons. Beyond Armenia's ancient borders, they entered Persia, that storied realm where poetry and cruelty dwelt together in palaces of rose-colored stone. Here Marco first encountered the intoxicating strangeness of the East. Merchants who spoke in musical tongues, carpets that seemed to capture entire gardens in their weave, and nights perfumed with jasmine and mystery. Through the cities of Tabriz and Isfahan they journeyed, each a jewel set in the desert's golden crown, each offering its own marvels to eyes hungry for wonder. Marco walked through bazaars where sellers offered everything from bottled moonlight to the dreams of sleeping poets, or so it seemed to a youth whose imagination transformed every sight into magic. The air itself seemed different here, charged with possibilities that Venice's practical canals have never whispered. As they pressed eastward, the land began to change, growing wilder and more forbidding with each mile. The gentle hills of Persia gave way to mountains that clawed at the sky with fingers of stone and snow. The Pamirs rose before them, those peaks that men called the roof of the world, where the air grew thin as spider's silk, and every breath was a victory wrested from the hostile heavens. It was in these cruel heights that Marco first learned the true price of his ambition. The cold bit deeper than any Venetian winter, and the altitude brought a sickness that turned food to ash in his mouth and made every step a monumental effort. For days he lay fevered in a humble dwelling, suspended between life and death, while his father and uncle watched with eyes that held the weight of terrible choice, to continue without him or to abandon their mission for his sake. When he finally recovered enough to travel, they descended into Afghanistan, where bandits haunted the roads like wolves, and honest merchants travelled in armed caravans or not at all. Here Marco spent nearly a year recovering his strength in the clear mountain air, learning the languages of the caravan routes and absorbing the wisdom of men who knew every danger between the Mediterranean and Cathay. His illness, terrible as it had been, became a strange blessing, for it taught him patience and gave him time to observe the intricate patterns of Eastern life. The final trial awaited them in the Gobi Desert, that sea of sand and stone, where mirages danced like demons and the sun blazed with the fury of a god denied worship. For weeks they trudged across wastes where nothing lived save the wind and the spirits of men who had dared too much. Marco learned to distinguish between the false wells conjured by his desperate thirst and the precious reality of water, between the phantom cities that beckoned from the horizon and the genuine landmarks that marked their progress toward their impossible goal. In the 4th year of their journey, when the seasons had turned full circle 4 times since they left Venice's familiar shores, the Polos finally beheld their destination. Shangdu, the summer palace of Kublai Khan, rose from the Mongolian plains like a vision born from the marriage of earth and heaven. Its walls encompass not merely buildings but an entire world, gardens where deer wandered freely among flowering trees, pavilions that seemed to float upon artificial lakes, and at its heart, a palace that defied every conception of mortal architecture. Marco's first glimpse of the great Khan left him speechless with wonder and reverence. Here was a man whose word governed more souls than populated all of Europe, yet who possessed the bearing of a philosopher and the curiosity of a scholar. Kublai Khan was then approaching his 60th year, his black eyes still sharp as a hawk's, his presence filling whatever space contained him. When he looked upon young Marco, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended the vast differences of culture and birth. The audience chamber where they were received sparkled with treasures beyond any Venetian merchant's dreams. Columns of precious marble supported a ceiling painted with dragons whose scales seemed to shift and shimmer in the lamplight. Courtiers dressed in silks that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime bowed before the Khan's raised dais, while guards in golden armor stood silent as statues along the walls. Niccolo and Maffeo presented their gifts, the holy oil from Jerusalem's sacred flame and Pope Gregory's letters, with the reverence due to a moment that might reshape the spiritual destiny of the world's greatest empire. The Khan received these tokens with a gravity that acknowledged their significance, though his eyes kept returning to Marco with an interest that seemed to puzzle even himself. "Who is this young man?" Kublai Khan asked, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. When Niccolo replied that Marco was his son and the Khan's loyal subject, something like a smile touched the ruler's lips. "He is welcome among us," the Khan declared, "and it pleases me well." With these simple words, Marco Polo's extraordinary career in the service of the Mongol Empire began. The weeks that followed passed like a dream of impossible luxury. Marco found himself housed in quarters that exceeded any palace he had imagined, served meals that were feasts for gods, and gradually introduced to the intricate ceremonies and customs of the Khan's court. Each day brought new wonders: mechanical clocks that chimed the hours, gardens where summer and winter flowers bloomed side by side, and libraries containing the wisdom of a dozen civilizations. Yet it was not the material splendor that most amazed Marco, but the Khan himself. In private audience, Kublai revealed himself as a man of fast learning and insatiable curiosity, hungry for knowledge of the world beyond his domains. Night after night, he questioned Marco about Venice, about European customs, about the Christian faith and Western learning. In return, he shared glimpses of Chinese philosophy and Mongol wisdom that opened new chambers in Marco's understanding. As the seasons turned and Marco's understanding of Chinese customs deepened, Kublai Khan began to entrust him with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible for one so young and foreign. The Khan had observed the Venetian youth with the calculating eye of a ruler who had conquered half the world, and he recognized in Marco qualities that even Venice had not suspected: a mind that could grasp complex situations swiftly, eyes that missed no significant detail, and a tongue that could relay information with precision and color. Marco's first missions were modest: inspecting tax collections in nearby provinces, carrying messages between the Khan's various palaces, observing the condition of roads and bridges. Yet even these simple tasks revealed his exceptional gifts. Where other envoys returned with dry recitations of facts and figures, Marco brought back living portraits of the lands he visited, complete with details of local customs, notable sights, and the temperament of the people. The Khan's delight in these reports grew with each mission, and soon Marco found himself appointed to positions of real authority. He served as governor of Yangzhou, a city whose population exceeded that of all Venice, administering justice and collecting taxes for a domain larger than most European kingdoms. The irony was not lost on him: a Venetian merchant's son, ruling over Chinese subjects in the name of a Mongol emperor, yet the system worked with an efficiency that amazed him. His travels in the Khan's service took him to the furthest corners of the empire and beyond. He sailed to Java and Ceylon, walked through the steaming jungles of Burma, and witnessed the strange customs of India's countless kingdoms. In Tibet, he marveled at monasteries perched impossibly on mountain peaks, where monks pursued enlightenment in solitude so complete it seemed like death to the living world. Each journey added new threads to the tapestry of wonder that was weaving itself in his memory. The Khan delighted particularly in Marco's accounts of military campaigns and foreign customs. When Marco returned from a mission to witness the conquest of a rebellious province, he could describe not only the tactics employed, but the songs the soldiers sang around their campfires, the prayers the enemy offered to their gods, and the exact color of the sunset on the evening the battle was decided. Such details, seemingly trivial, painted pictures in the Khan's mind that dry military reports could never achieve. In the imperial capital of Khan Balik, which men would later call Beijing, Marco witnessed the daily miracle of governing an empire that spanned continents. He learned to read the complex signs by which the Khan's will was transmitted across impossible distances. The relay stations where fresh horses waited for imperial messengers, the detailed records that tracked every grain of rice and bolt of silk in the imperial warehouses, the elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the divine nature of imperial authority. 17 years passed in this service. 17 years during which Marco Polo became not merely an observer of the East, but a participant in its greatest dramas. He advised on matters of state, led diplomatic missions to foreign courts, and witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. Yet through it all, somewhere in the deepest chambers of his heart, the memory of Venice's bells and the scent of her canals remained alive, growing stronger with each passing season, until they became not merely memories, but a calling that could no longer be denied. The empire over which Kublai Khan ruled was a world within worlds, a realm so vast and varied that a man could spend lifetimes exploring its wonders without exhausting its mysteries. Marco Polo, granted access to nearly every corner of this domain through his duties as the Khan's envoy, witnessed marvels that challenged everything Europeans believed about the nature of civilization itself. In Khan Balik, the Khan's winter capital, Marco walked through streets wider than Venice's broadest canal, paved with stones so perfectly fitted that no grass could grow between them. The city's markets offered goods from every corner of the earth, furs from the Russian forests, pearls from the Indian Ocean, spices from islands so remote they had no names in any European tongue. Yet what amazed Marco most was not the wealth displayed, but the order that governed it all, the intricate systems that fed and houses millions with fire, and only know more wherever you live. The Khan's court itself was a universe of elaborate ceremony and breathtaking luxury. Daily audiences followed rituals so complex they required years to master, yet every gesture held meaning. Every color and arrangement spoke in a language older than memory. Marco learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the Khan's mood, to recognize the hierarchy that placed every courtier in his precise position, to understand the delicate balance of power that held this vast empire together. Chinese innovations astonished Marco at every turn. He marveled at paper money backed by the Khan's authority alone, currency so trusted that merchants accepted it for goods worth their weight in gold. He witnessed printing presses creating books in hours that would take European scribes months to copy by hand. Coal burned in Chinese hearths, a black stone that generated heat unknown to those who burned only wood and charcoal. The postal system that connected the empire's farthest reaches operated with a precision that put European communications to shame. Riders on the finest horses covered impossible distances in days that should have required weeks, carrying the Khan's commands to governors and generals across half the world. Rest stations equipped with fresh mounts and provisions dotted the roads at regular intervals, each maintained with military discipline. Religious tolerance pervaded the empire in ways that would have shocked medieval Europe. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists and Confucians served side by side in the Khan's administration, their differences in faith no barrier to advancement or honor. The Khan himself, though raised in the Mongol shamanic tradition, welcomed teachers from every creed, seeking wisdom wherever it might be found. Marco observed the seasonal rhythms that govern court life, the migration between summer and winter palaces that moved entire populations with clockwork regularity. At Shandu, the summer capital, he watched the Khan hunt with trained cheetahs and golden eagles, witnessed archery contests where the prize was a province, and attended feasts where exotic delicacies from every corner of Asia graced tables that stretched beyond the horizon. The woman of the court, though largely invisible to foreign eyes, wielded influence that Marco gradually came to understand. The Khan's wives and daughters commanded vast households, controlled extensive lands, and shaped policy through channels invisible to casual observers. Their gardens, their arts, their festivals created a parallel world of power and beauty that complemented the empire's masculine displays of military might and administrative efficiency. Time flowed differently in the court of Kublai Khan, measured not by the familiar bells of Christendom, but by the ancient rhythms of an empire that seemed eternal. 17 years had passed since Marco's arrival at Chengdu. 17 years, during which the young Venetian had become a man of authority and influence in the service of the world's greatest ruler. Yet as the seasons turned and the Khan aged, a restlessness began to stir in the hearts of the three polos, a longing for home that grew stronger with each passing moon. Kublai Khan, now in his 70s, had grown to regard the polos not merely as useful servants, but as cherished companions in his long reign. He delighted in their Western perspectives, their tales of distant Venice, and their unique ability to see his empire through foreign eyes. The thought of losing them filled him with a melancholy that his courtiers had rarely witnessed in their mighty sovereign. When Niccolò and Maffeo first broached the subject of returning to Venice, the Khan's refusal was swift and absolute. "You seek to abandon us after so many years of favor and honor?" The Khan asked, his voice carrying a weight of personal hurt that surprised even Marco. "What does Venice offer that our empire cannot provide?" Yet beneath his words lay a deeper fear, that with their departure, something irreplaceable would be lost, some spark of curiosity and wonder that they had brought to his court. Marco felt torn between loyalty to his sovereign and the pull of his homeland. Venice lived in his dreams now, with a clarity that amazed him. He could hear the splash of oars in her canals, smell the salt air that carried news from distant seas, see the faces of kinsmen who had grown old in his absence. The boy who had left Venice was gone forever, replaced by a man who carried within himself the memories of two worlds, yet belonged fully to neither. For months the Khan refused to consider their departure, finding reasons to delay any discussion of the matter. Important missions required Marco's attention. Diplomatic crises demanded his insight. Provincial uprisings needed his administrative skills. Each assignment was genuine, each task truly important, yet all served to postpone the inevitable conversation that would determine their fate. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Princess Kokachin, a Mongol maiden of noble blood and extraordinary beauty, had been promised in marriage to the Khan's great-nephew Argon, ruler of Persia. The overland route to her new home had become treacherous due to tribal warfare, and the princess's safety required a sea voyage through dangerous waters. Who better to escort her than the experienced polos, whose knowledge of navigation and foreign lands might see her safely to her destiny? The Khan's agreement came reluctantly, tinged with conditions that revealed his deep attachment to his foreign servants. They must promise to return after delivering the princess, They must carry letters to the Pope and the kings of Europe. They must serve as his ambassadors to the Western world. Yet even as he spoke these conditions, both ruler and subjects understood that this parting might well be their last meeting in this world. The preparations for departure stretched across months, as though the Khan sought to delay the inevitable through the sheer complexity of equipping such a journey. Ships were prepared, crews selected, provisions loaded, gifts chosen. Each detail became an excuse to postpone the final farewell, each requirement a reason to extend their remaining time together. Yet finally, inevitably, the day of departure could be delayed no longer. The fleet that bore the Polos and Princess Kokachin from the familiar shores of Kublai Khan's empire consisted of 14 ships, each a marvel of Chinese naval architecture, their holds filled with treasures beyond counting, and their decks crowded with over 600 souls bound for the distant Persian Gulf. Marco stood at the stern of the lead vessel as the Chinese coastline faded into morning mist, watching the empire that had shaped his manhood disappear like a dream upon waking. The South China Sea greeted them with deceptive calm, her blue waters sparkling under tropical sunshine as they sailed past islands that seemed to float like green jewels upon the ocean's breast. Princess Kokachin proved a gracious and brave companion, her beauty enhanced by a dignity that made every man in the fleet her willing protector. She spent hours listening to Marco's accounts of the Western world she had never seen, while he found himself learning from her the subtle arts of Mongol diplomacy and the deep wisdom of Eastern philosophy. As they sailed southward through the Straits of Malacca, the journey's true dangers began to reveal themselves. Fierce storms arose without warning, driving mountainous waves across their decks and testing the skills of even the most experienced sailors. Pirates haunted these waters like sea wolves, their swift vessels darting from hidden coves to strike at merchant fleets before vanishing again into a maze of islands and reefs. In the ports of Sumatra and Ceylon, they encountered cultures that defied Marco's wildest imaginings. He walked through cities built on stilts above tropical lagoons, witnessed ceremonies where dancers moved like living flames, and observed trade in goods so exotic their very names sounded like incantations. Yet always they were strangers passing through, their true destination still months of sailing distant across the Indian Ocean's vast expanse. The monsoon season brought trials that tested the faith of even the most devout. Winds that could tear a man's words from his lips before he could speak them drove the fleet through seas that towered higher than cathedral spires. Several ships were lost to the fury of storms that seemed born from the very wrath of heaven, taking with them dozens of souls whose names would never be recorded in any earthly chronicle. Disease stalked the survivors like an invisible demon, claiming victims with terrifying randomness. Marco watched strong men waste away to shadows, while women and children somehow found the strength to endure. The princess herself fell gravely ill during the crossing of the Arabian Sea, and for weeks her life hung by a thread finer than silk, while the fleet's physicians exhausted their arts in her service. When they finally reached the Persian Gulf, only a fraction of their original company remained alive. The survivors had been transformed by their ordeal into something deeper than mere travelers. They had become brothers and sisters, bound by shared suffering and mutual dependence. Princess Kokachin, recovered from her illness but forever changed by her brush with death, greeted the Persian shore with tears of gratitude and sorrow intermingled. The final irony awaited them in Persia itself. Argon, the prince who was to have been Kokachin's husband, had died during their long voyage, leaving his intended bride a widow before she could become a wife. Yet such were the complexities of Mongol succession that she was wed instead to Argon's son, maintaining the alliance that her marriage had been designed to cement. The princess, showing the same grace that had sustained her through their perilous journey, accepted this twist of fate with dignity that moved even hardened Persian courtiers to admiration. Venice, in 1295, was both exactly as Marco remembered and utterly transformed by his long absence. The same bells rang across the same canals. The same salt breezes carried the same mixture of spice and sea foam. Yet the city seemed smaller somehow, more confined after the vast horizons of Kublai Khan's empire. 24 years had passed since the Polo's departure, and the Venice they found was a city that had grown prosperous in their absence, while forgetting the 3 merchants who had vanished into the mysterious east. Their own house in the San Giovanni Grisostomo quarter had been occupied by distant relatives, who stared in amazement at these 3 sun-weathered strangers, claiming to be the long-lost Polos. The men who stood before them bore little resemblance to the Venetians who had departed nearly a quarter-century earlier. Their skin was darkened by Asian suns, their beards were streaked with grey, and their eyes held depths that spoke of wonders seen and sorrows endured, beyond the comprehension of those who had never left the familiar circuits of Mediterranean trade. Marco, now a man of 41, with the bearing of one who had governed cities and counselled emperors, found himself regarded with suspicion by neighbours, who remember only the eager youth who had departed with such grand dreams. The days of Combat Day set up the days of Derry, our seas on fire. Their clothes, practical garments suited to long travel, appeared shabby and foreign to Venetian eyes, accustomed to displaying wealth through silk and ornament. Even their speech had been affected by their long absence, peppered with words from a dozen Eastern tongues, and inflected with rhythms that sounded strange in Venice's narrow streets. The skepticism of their fellow citizens might have condemned them to poverty and ridicule, but the Polos possessed proof of their incredible journey that could not be dismissed. In a gesture that would become legend, they invited their doubting relatives and neighbours to a great feast, appearing at the meal dressed in their travel-worn garments. Then, before the astonished eyes of their guests, they began to tear apart the seams of their shabby robes. From within the lining of those humble garments poured forth such a treasure as Venice had rarely seen. Rubies, like drops of dragon's blood, emeralds that held the essence of eastern forests, diamonds that captured and scattered light like trapped stars, and pearls of such size and lustre that each one alone could purchase a palazzo. The precious stones scattered across the table like seeds of wonder, proof undeniable that the Polos had indeed reached the fabled courts of the great Khan and returned bearing the rewards of faithful service. The transformation in their treatment was immediate and complete. Those who had whispered doubts behind their backs now pressed forward with eager questions and offers of friendship. The Polo name, which had seemed destined for obscurity, suddenly blazed with renewed glory throughout Venice's merchant community. Marco found himself besieged with requests for audiences, his opinions on Eastern trade sought by the most powerful families in the Republic. The sun was far, and the sun was cutting no. The sun was far. Yet even as Venice embraced them as heroes returned from legend, Marco struggled with a deeper challenge: how to convey the true magnitude of what they had witnessed. The treasures they displayed were tangible proof of distant wealth, but how could he make his countrymen understand the intellectual and spiritual riches he had encountered? How could he describe cities that dwarfed Venice, inventions that seemed like magic, and a civilization whose ancient wisdom challenged every European assumption about the nature of the world? The young man who had dreamed of Eastern marvels had returned as one who had lived among miracles. Yet he discovered that the greatest challenge of his journey lay not in reaching Cathay, but in finding words that could bridge the vast gap between the world he had experienced and the world that surrounded him in the familiar canals of home. 3 years after their homecoming, the Polos found themselves once again swept up in Venice's eternal dance of commerce and conflict. The Republic's rivalry with Genoa, that other great maritime power, had flared into open warfare, and every able-bodied Venetian was called upon to defend their city's honor and trading interests. Marco, despite his years of peaceful service in Kublai Khan's court, took command of a galley in the Venetian fleet, his experiences in distant campaigns having taught him lessons in leadership that served him well in Mediterranean waters. The Battle of Curzala in September 1298 proved a disaster for Venetian arms. The Genoese fleet, commanded with skill and daring, overwhelmed their enemies in an engagement that left hundreds dead and many more prisoners in enemy hands. Marco found himself among the captives, chained in the hold of a Genoese vessel and bound for imprisonment in that rival city which had long contested Venice's dominance of Eastern trade. The prison in Genoa, where Marco was confined, was a place of stone and shadow, its walls echoing with the despair of men torn from their homes and families. Yet fate, which had already shaped Marco's life in ways beyond ordinary imagination, had one more extraordinary gift to bestow upon him. Among his fellow prisoners was Rustichello of Pisa, a man whose reputation as a writer of romances had spread throughout the Italian courts before his own capture in the endless conflicts that plagued the peninsula. Rustichello possessed that rarest of medieval accomplishments, the ability to transform spoken words into written narrative that could capture and hold a reader's attention across vast distances of time and space. When he learned of Marco's incredible journey and the wonders he had witnessed, the writer recognized an opportunity that transcended the misery of their captivity. Here was a tale that surpassed even the wildest romances of Arthur's knights or Charlemagne's paladins. Yet every word of it was sworn to be true. Through the long months of their imprisonment, Marco began to dictate his memories to Rustichello's eager pen. The process was neither simple nor swift, for Marco spoke in the Venetian dialect, while Rustichello wrote in the French that was then the language of Romance literature. Each event had to be carefully recalled, each wonder precisely described, each name and distance verified from memory against the test of credibility. The work that emerged from their collaboration was unlike anything medieval literature had produced. E Milione, as it came to be called, was neither pure history nor pure romance, but something entirely new, a travel narrative that combined the precision of a merchant's accounts with the wonder of a poet's vision. Marco's practical eye for detail merged with Rustichello's gift for storytelling to create a work that transported readers across continents and cultures with unprecedented vividness. As Marco recounted his years in Kublai Khan's service, the stone walls of their Genoese cell seemed to dissolve, replaced by the golden pavilions of Shangyu, the bustling markets of Kambalik, and the vast horizons of the Mongol Empire. Rustichello's pen flew across parchment, capturing not merely the facts of Marco's journey, but its essential spirit, the wonder of a young man encountering marvels that challenged everything his world, all the same parts as paved by the words of some Christian Briton. There is nothing but the fact. The irony was not lost on either man that their masterpiece was being created in captivity, far from the Venice Marco loved, and the courts where Rustichello had once entertained nobles with tales of imaginary heroes. Yet perhaps it was precisely this enforced solitude that allowed them to focus completely on their task, free from the distractions that might have prevented such intensive collaboration in freedom. When they were finally released in 1299, as part of a general exchange of prisoners, both men carried with them something more precious than liberty, the knowledge that they had created a work that would outlive them both, a book that would carry Marco's memories of the East to readers yet unborn, inspiring dreams and journeys that would reshape the world itself. Upon his release from Genoese captivity, Marco Polo returned to a Venice that had changed once again in his absence, yet which welcomed him now not merely as a successful merchant, but as something far rarer, a man whose name had become synonymous with wonder itself. The manuscript of his travels, painstakingly crafted during those months of imprisonment, began its own journey across medieval Europe, copied by scribes, translated into multiple languages, and read aloud in courts and marketplaces from London to Constantinople. Marco himself settled into the comfortable rhythms of Venetian domestic life with a grace that surprised those who had expected him to chafe against such ordinary constraints after his extraordinary adventures. In 1300, he married Donata Badoa, daughter of a respected merchant family, and together they raised 3 daughters, Fantina, Bellella, and Moretta, whose names would echo through Venetian records long after their famous father had passed into legend. Yet, even as Marco embraced the role of husband and father, his reputation as Marco of the Millions, Il Milione, followed him through Venice's narrow streets and bustling Campo. The nickname, bestowed by neighbours who marvelled at his tales of countless cities and countless treasures, carried within it both admiration and a subtle mockery from those who found his stories too wondrous to believe entirely. Children would point at him as he passed, whispering that here walked the man who had seen dragons and cities of gold, while merchants cornered him in the Rialto to seek advice about Eastern trade routes and the customs of distant lands. The book itself took on a life independent of its author, spreading across Europe with the persistence of legend itself. Kings and princes demanded copies for their libraries, scholars debated its revelations in university halls, and common folk gathered around literate neighbours to hear tales of the great Khan's court read aloud by firelight. Each copying introduced small changes, each translation subtle shifts in meaning. Yet the essential wonder of Marco's journey remained intact, inspiring dreams in minds that had never imagined horizons beyond their village boundaries. Marco watched this phenomenon with the bemused satisfaction of a man who had planted a seed and witnessed it grow into a mighty tree. He continued his involvement in Venice's trade, his Eastern experiences making him a valued consultant on matters of international commerce. Yet he seemed content to let others pursue the more dangerous paths he had once travelled. His fortune grew steadily through careful investments and prudent partnerships, allowing him to provide well for his family while maintaining the comfortable lifestyle befitting a man of his reputation. As the years passed, the contrast between Marco's quiet domestic existence and the extraordinary adventures recorded in his book became a source of fascination for those who knew him. Here was a man who had governed Chinese cities and counselled the world's mightiest emperor, yet who now concerned himself with the dowries of his daughters and the management of his warehouses. The apparent contradiction spoke to something profound about human nature, that even the most extraordinary experiences must eventually be woven into the fabric of ordinary life. When visitors came to Venice, specifically to meet the famous traveller, they often left slightly disappointed by the encounter. They had expected to find someone marked by his experiences, perhaps restless with memories of greater days. Yet Marco received them with the courtesy of any prosperous merchant, answering their questions with patience, while displaying no apparent longing for the adventures of his youth. Only in his eyes, perhaps, could the most perceptive observers detect traces of the wonders he had witnessed, a depth that spoke of horizons seen and marvels experienced, beyond the comprehension of those who had never left Europe's familiar shores. On January 8, 1324, as the winter winds swept across Venice's lagoon and the bells of San Marco tolled their ancient rhythms, Marco Polo breathed his last in the city of his birth, surrounded by the loving care of his wife and daughters. The man who had walked through the palaces of Kublai Khan and witnessed the birth of a new age passed quietly into the realm of memory. Yet his death marked not an ending, but a transformation, from living witness to eternal inspiration. The influence of his great book had already begun to reshape European understanding of the world beyond their borders. In monasteries and universities, scholars pored over manuscripts of In Milione, comparing Marco's descriptions with classical authorities and finding in his accounts evidence of divine providence working through human curiosity. The existence of vast Christian populations in distant Asia, which Marco had reported, fired imaginations already inflamed by crusading fervor and dreams of universal faith. Among the most devoted students of Marco's narrative was a young Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, who annotated his copy of the book with marginal notes that revealed his burning desire to reach the lands Marco had described. The gold-roofed temples of Cipanglu, the spice-rich islands of the Indian Ocean, and the sophisticated cities of Cathay beckoned to Columbus across the ocean's western horizon, promising routes to riches that would justify the most audacious of voyages. Yet Columbus was but one of countless men who felt their lives redirected by Marco's testimony. Portuguese captains sailing around Africa's Horn carried copies of Il Milione as guides to the wonders they hoped to find, while Spanish conquistadors sought in the New World the golden cities that Marco had described in the Old. Each voyage of discovery carried within it echoes of the Venetian's journey, each explorer measuring his own adventures against the standard Marco had established. The book's impact extended far beyond mere navigation and conquest. European understanding of geography, culture, and commerce was fundamentally altered by Marco's revelations. The notion that Christian Europe represented the pinnacle of civilization crumbled before his descriptions of Chinese innovations and Mongol administrative efficiency. Paper money, coal heating, and movable type bridges, technologies that Marco had witnessed in routine operation, began to appear in European cities, carried by merchants and travelers who followed the routes his book had mapped. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, Il Milione changed European consciousness itself, expanding the mental horizons of a continent that had long looked inward. The book demonstrated that the world was far larger, far more diverse, and far more wonderful than medieval Christianity had imagined. It planted seeds of curiosity that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance's explosion of exploration, discovery, and artistic achievement. In the academies and courts of Europe, Marco's legacy lived on, through the countless scholars, merchants, and adventurers who drew inspiration from his example. His demonstration that barriers of language, culture, and distance could be overcome through courage, adaptability, and intellectual curiosity became a model for future generations. The quiet Venetian merchant had shown that ordinary men could achieve extraordinary things, that the impossible was merely the difficult viewed from a distance. As centuries passed and the world Marco had known vanished beneath the tide of historical change, his book remained constant, a bridge spanning time itself. The Mongol Empire crumbled, Kublai Khan's dynasty fell, and the very cities Marco had governed were transformed beyond recognition. Yet his words preserved a moment in human history when East and West had met in mutual wonder and respect, creating possibilities that would echo through all the ages to come.